The fiery appeal of the first consul to the nation shattered all hopes of foreign powers that the French people were exhausted by war. In an instant, society's apathy and fatigue, born of the burdens of war, transformed into martial fervor and readiness for battle. And as if in the early days of the Republic, the tolling of alarm bells once again echoed across all of France. The call to arms also resonated beyond the Republic's borders. Those who had left the Republic during the Directory began returning to France. Among those who responded to the call for help was Carnot, a remarkable military administrator and the organizer of the Republic's first victories. Bonaparte immediately brought him into the highest ranks of military leadership. Then, with his characteristic energy, the first consul, together with Carnot and Berthier, set about the intense preparation for the campaign that would determine the Republic's fate. On the Rhine, the imperial forces had assembled an army of 150,000. Of these, 30,000 were stationed in garrisons. The remaining 120,000 troops, equipped with significant artillery and an especially excellent cavalry, for which the Austrians had long been renowned, formed the active army under the command of Baron Craw. In northern Italy, excluding the garrisons, Baron Milos mobilized a 100,000-strong army. The British fleet continually patrolled the Gulf of Genoa, supporting all Austrian operations. Additionally, reinforcements numbering 20,000 troops were expected to arrive from the King of Naples. Thus, the coalition had assembled an army of nearly 300,000 against France. General Moreau was appointed to oppose Craw, commanding an army of 120,000. However, in Italy, the French could not achieve parity of forces. Against Milos's 100,000 troops stood only 45,000 French soldiers under the command of the valiant Massena. Bonaparte was at a disadvantage compared to the coalition in terms of mobilization and material resources. Funds barely sufficed to pay soldiers' wages, and the shortage of ammunition and horses, particularly acute in the Italian theater of war, was a cause of great anxiety. Therefore, hopes were placed solely on a short campaign. There was neither the money nor the ammunition for a prolonged war. At the same time, the duration of this campaign was limited not only by the scarcity of material resources, but also by the situation of French troops in Egypt. After Bonaparte departed from France, relative calm and order prevailed in Egypt, at least throughout the autumn of 1799. However, plague and other diseases constantly threatened the army, which had dwindled to 28,000 men by this time. General Kleber, who had become commander-in-chief against his will, viewed the future pessimistically and harbored no hopes for the swift arrival of reinforcements. Before leaving Egypt, Bonaparte had left Kleber extensive instructions on internal governance. These concluded with the directive that if by May 1800 Kleber had neither received assistance nor any news from France, he was authorized to make peace with the Porte, even if it required evacuation from Egypt. However, Kleber was determined to reach a peace agreement as soon as possible and evacuate to France. Not all generals supported such a plan. Generals such as Davout, Desaix, and Manu were against evacuation. Nevertheless, they refrained from openly opposing the new commander-in-chief. Kleber's haste was partly driven by the fact that by this time, an 80,000-strong army of the Grand Vizier had already been organized in Syria. Despite such impressive numbers, the French could still fight the Turks, as nearly half of the Grand Vizier's army consisted of non-combatants. However, Kleber clearly understood that any victory he might achieve, no matter how brilliant, would still deplete his forces. And sooner or later he would inevitably fall under the repeated blows of the enemy's inexhaustible armies. Wishing to avoid further bloodshed, Kleber sent a letter to the Sultan proposing negotiations. Mustafa Pasha, the Turkish commander captured at Abu Qir, agreed to mediate. Nonetheless, the Grand Vizier remained unyielding. Then, unexpectedly, Sir Sidney Smith took on the role of mediating negotiations. After considerable effort, he managed to persuade the vizier to enter into talks with the French. On December 22nd, General Desaix and French diplomats boarded a British battleship, where preliminary negotiations with Sir Sidney Smith immediately began. These talks lasted about a month. There was no question of capitulation. The French were prepared to evacuate Egypt only on honorable terms. Finally, an agreement was reached, and on January 24, 1800, at El Arish, already captured by the Turks, the parties signed a convention for evacuation. Under its terms, the French were to evacuate the provinces of Upper and Lower Egypt within 10 days after the agreement's ratification, and Cairo within a month. All French forces were to withdraw from Alexandria, Aboukir, and Rosetta to await the arrival of Turkish transport ships. The Turks were obligated to transport the French army, along with its weapons and baggage, to France and to allocate about 2 million francs for its upkeep in Egypt. For a month after the agreement's ratification, Kléber scrupulously adhered to its terms. General Desaix was tasked with traveling to France to inform the Directory that an agreement had been reached. However, events took an entirely unexpected turn after that. On March 2nd, Brigadier General Latour Mouboua arrived in Cairo from Paris with news of the 18th Brumaire and a copy of the new constitution that made Bonaparte the head of state. These developments led the generals to think again that the evacuation was premature. Almost simultaneously with the dispatches from Paris, Kléber received even more alarming news from French diplomats who had remained with Sir Sidney Smith as special commissioners for the armistice. Admiral Keith had informed Sir Sidney that he had received firm instructions from the British government to disregard any agreement reached between the Grand Vizier and the French. This resulted in the arrest of General Desaix, who had been sent to France with a safe conduct by Admiral Keith. Among other things, Keith told Desaix, "I think that you, who proclaim the principle of universal equality, will be perfectly satisfied if I feed you on the same rations as the soldiers." "I am content with everything, Admiral," Desaix replied, "but I have dealt with Mamluks and Bedouins in Egypt, and all of them kept their word, which you have not. The only thing I ask is that you spare me your presence." Sidney Smith, valuing his honor, declared that the situation was a misunderstanding, which he promised to resolve promptly. General Kléber demanded that the Turkish army halt its advance while the obstacles were being addressed. However, this did not happen. Finally, on March 18th, everything became clear when Kléber received a personal letter from Lord Keith written in a coarse and offensive tone. In the letter, Keith informed the general that His Majesty could not agree to any terms other than unconditional surrender. By that time, the Grand Vizier and his army were nearly at the gates of Cairo. At that moment, Kléber experienced a fierce awakening. Within 24 hours, he rescinded all orders for evacuation and truce and issued a proclamation to his army. This proclamation, besides including the full text of Keith's letter, contained only 2 other lines. "Soldiers, the only response to such insolence is victory. Prepare for battle." At 2 a.m. on March 20th, Kléber sent out from Cairo with Friant's and Régnier's divisions, along with Leclerc's cavalry, to confront the enemy. That same day, near the ruins of Heliopolis, Kléber achieved perhaps his most brilliant victory. Under his command, 12,000 French troops crushed an army 4 times their size. The remnants of the Turkish forces retreated to Syria, but there they were destroyed by Bedouins. Following this, Kléber moved his divisions to Cairo, where he suppressed an uprising. Thus, French control was restored, and Kléber continued his efforts, hoping to maintain their position in Egypt until a general peace was concluded. However, everything now depended on developments on the European fronts. Meanwhile, the Rhine campaign was nearing its start. After improving the material conditions of the main armies, the first consul began forming a reserve army in strict secrecy. At the right moment, Bonaparte intended to use this army to create a decisive advantage at a chosen part of the front. These troops were being formed in various western departments. The concentration planned to occur directly from the march, just days before the operation, to deprive the enemy of any opportunity for countermeasures. The creation of the reserve army was accompanied by a large-scale disinformation campaign. In Dijon, a public recruitment of volunteers and young conscripts was initiated. Fake decrees and publications in newspapers were deliberately released. As expected, Dijon immediately attracted the attention of enemy spies. What they saw greatly amused the imperial forces. The Austrian press was soon filled with caricatures and mockery of the first consul and his newly assembled army. Little did they know this was precisely Bonaparte's intention. Meanwhile, regiments from the western departments were gradually moving toward the eastern borders. The campaign plan devised by the first consul involved delivering the main blow on the Rhine using two armies, the Army of the Rhine and the Reserve Army. The operation was to begin with a feigned crossing of the river south of Strasbourg by one of Moreau's army corps. After this diversionary maneuver, the reserve army secretly assembled between Basel and Schaffhausen was to construct 4 bridges in a single morning, cross the Rhine, and, with support from the right wing of Moreau's army, strike a crushing blow against Croix's left flank. In this disposition, Croix's army left wing was doomed. As on the Upper Rhine, Bonaparte sought not only numerical superiority, but also qualitative advantage. After the front's collapse on the Upper Rhine, a rapid breakthrough into the Danube Valley would follow, and within 6 to 7 days, the French could be near Ulm. With favorable conditions, with another month, 2 French armies could be at the gates of a submissive Vienna. At this time, General Massena was to hold the line in the Ligurian mountains, distracting Milos's forces. The large-scale offensive on the Rhine required close cooperation between the two armies, but unexpectedly, serious difficulties arose in this regard. The maneuvers of such large masses of troops in a confined space alarmed General Moreau, who insisted that the Rhine crossing should be carried out evenly at 4 points far apart from each other. Despite the appeals of Carnot and the first consul to adhere to the existing plan, Moreau displayed insurmountable stubbornness, which delayed the offensive and forced Bonaparte to consider alternative campaign options. What Moreau dares not to do on the Rhine, I will do over the Alps. Finally, the plan to strike the Rhine salient collapsed completely when, on April 5th, to the astonishment of the French, the enemy seized the initiative by launching an unexpected general offensive in northern Italy. The Austrians had designated Italy as their primary theater of war, relegating Germany to secondary importance. Milos's task was to push Massena out of the Apennines, capture Genoa, cross the Var River, and ultimately lay siege to Toulon with the aid of the British Navy. In a very short time, General Milos achieved his first objective. In a series of fierce battles, he broke through the French center and captured Savona, thereby splitting the French army into 2 parts. Massena, with 18,000 soldiers, retreated to Genoa under fire, while General Suchet was forced back to Nice. By the 3rd week of April, General Ott had encircled Genoa in a tight siege, while the British fleet blockaded the city from the sea. Much depended on how long Massena could hold out. His control of Genoa was the only significant obstacle to General Milos's planned invasion of France. The fall of Genoa would undoubtedly be followed by the capture of Nice and then Toulon. The collapse of the Italian front and Massena's dire situation in Genoa formed the basis for Bonaparte's audacious plan. He decided to take advantage of the favorable position in Switzerland to lead the reserve army across the Alps and strike Milos from the rear. During the snowmelt, the Alps were considered impassable, at least for entire armies, so the Austrians did not anticipate an attack from this direction. This was an extremely difficult operation to execute. Bonaparte needed to combine complete decisiveness and speed with maximum caution, for even if the French managed to cross the Alps, they would find themselves behind enemy lines, facing forces twice their number. There was no room for error in such a scenario. The new campaign plan shocked the French staff. Even Berthier, a seasoned campaigner, was overwhelmed with pessimism and despair. Nevertheless, the first consul was firm in his intentions and repeatedly had to bolster the spirits of his doubting chief of staff. Moreau's role was simply to cross the Rhine and push Croix 6 to 8 marches away from Switzerland to secure the rear of the reserve army. Afterward, Moreau was to halt his advance and detach Lecourbe's corps to join the reserve army. Meanwhile, the situation in Genoa was deteriorating daily. Massena managed to secretly send a message stating that he could hold out for no more than 15 days. There was no time to lose. At midnight that same day, the first consul's convoy departed Paris, and a message was sent to General Massena in Genoa containing only a few lines. I am coming to your aid with the reserve army. Hold out until May 20th.